The blood-red sun was hanging low over the horizon as Bethany Reynolds clutched her feverish son to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she placed another cool cloth on his burning forehead. She had never felt more alone or more desperate in all her 22 years than she did at that moment in her small cabin on the outskirts of Naco, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1884. "Hush now, James," she whispered, her voice breaking as the 4-year-old whimpered in his fitful sleep. "Mama's here. You're going to be just fine." But the words rang hollow in the empty room, for she knew that without medicine, her promises were as empty as the cabinet where she had desperately searched for anything that might break his fever. For 3 days, James had been burning up, his small body racked with chills one moment and burning like a furnace the next. The rash that had started on his chest now spread across his entire body, and the cough that tore from his lungs sounded worse with each passing hour. Bethany knew enough about illness to recognize that her son was slipping away from her, and the thought made her heart constrict with a pain so sharp she could scarcely breathe. She had buried her husband Thomas just last winter, taken by pneumonia after falling through the ice while hunting. Now it seemed the cruel Arizona wilderness was determined to take her son as well. The nearest doctor was in Bisbee, a full day's ride away, and she had no horse to make the journey. The neighbors who might have helped lived miles away, and with the spring rains, the trails would be treacherous and slow going by foot. "Please, God," she prayed, pressing her forehead against her son's hot cheek. "Please don't take him too. He's all I have left." A sudden pounding at her door startled her so badly she nearly dropped the cloth she was holding. Night had fallen completely now, and visitors after dark were rare in these parts. For a moment, fear gripped her. Outlaws and renegades were known to pass through the territory, but desperation pushed her to her feet. She grabbed the rifle Thomas had taught her to use and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lucas Foster, madam," came the reply, the deep voice unfamiliar to her ears. "I'm passing through to Bisbee. Saw your light and thought to ask for water for my horse." Bethany hesitated, then slid the bolt back and opened the door just enough to see the man standing on her porch. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face and dark hair beneath his wide-brimmed hat, he looked like many of the cowboys who drifted through the territory. But there was something in his clear blue eyes that gave her pause a steadiness that spoke of reliability rather than the wildness she'd seen in the eyes of dangerous men. "I don't mean to disturb you, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I can move on if—" He stopped abruptly, his gaze moving past her to where James lay on the small bed in the corner of the one-room cabin. "Your boy's sick," he stated, his tone changing from polite to concerned. Bethany nodded, unable to stop the fresh tears that sprang to her eyes. "He's burning up. 3 days now. I've tried everything I have, but—" She swallowed hard. "I have nothing left to give him." Lucas Foster's gaze sharpened. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the boy. Something in his demeanor, the quiet confidence, perhaps made Bethany step aside. She watched as he crossed to the bed and knelt beside James, his movements gentle as he placed a large, calloused hand on the boy's forehead. "Scarlet fever, most likely," he said after a moment. "My sister had it when she was young. He needs medicine, and soon." "The doctor's in Bisbee," Bethany said helplessly. "I have no horse, and even if I could walk it, I'll go," Lucas interrupted, already rising to his feet. "I was headed there anyway. The doctor will have what he needs." Bethany stared at him in disbelief. "But you don't know us." "Why would you, madam?" he said simply. "Where I come from, we don't let children suffer if we can help it." He glanced out the window at the darkness. "It's a hard ride at night, but I know the trail. I can be there by dawn if I push hard and back by tomorrow evening." "I can't pay you," she admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "Not yet, the farm hasn't." He waved her concerns away. "We'll sort that later. Your boy can't wait." He was already moving toward the door. "Keep him cool as best you can. Get some broth in him if he'll take it." Bethany followed him to the porch, watching as he swung up onto his horse, a magnificent bay that looked as strong and steadfast as its rider. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Foster." "Lucas," he corrected. "And thank me when I get back with the medicine." He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "What's your name, madam?" "Bethany Reynolds. And my son is James." Lucas nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll be back as quick as I can, Bethany. You keep that boy fighting until then." Without another word, he turned his horse and spurred it into a gallop, disappearing into the darkness beyond her small homestead. Bethany stood on the porch long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, her heart torn between desperate hope and the fear that he would never return, or that he would return too late. Lucas Foster bent low over his horse's neck, urging the animal to maintain its pace despite the treacherous trail. The moon cast just enough light for him to navigate, but he knew one misstep could send them both tumbling down the rocky slopes. His body ached from the long day's ride that had preceded this unexpected mission, but he pushed the discomfort aside, focusing instead on the image of the feverish boy and his desperate mother. He had not planned to stop at the isolated cabin. After 2 years driving cattle across the territory, he was on his way to Bisbee to collect payment owed to him, before heading north to start fresh. The ranch he'd worked for had been sold, and at 30 years old, Lucas was tired of having nothing to show for his years of hard work beyond the horse beneath him and the few possessions in his saddlebags. But the moment he'd seen the terror in Bethany Reynolds' eyes and the sickness ravaging her son, all thoughts of his own problems had vanished. He knew what it was to lose family. He'd buried his parents and a younger brother back in Texas before striking out on his own. He would not stand by and watch another family torn apart if he could prevent it. The trail narrowed as it wound through a rocky pass, forcing him to slow his horse to a careful walk. Ahead, he could see storm clouds gathering, and he muttered a curse under his breath. Rain would turn the trail to mud and make the journey twice as difficult. He would have to push harder now while the path was still navigable. "Come on, Apollo," he urged the bay. "We've got lives depending on us tonight." As if understanding the gravity of their mission, the horse surged forward, its powerful muscles bunching beneath him as they continued their relentless journey through the Arizona night. Back at the cabin, Bethany kept her vigil beside James, changing the cool cloths on his forehead and speaking softly to him whenever he stirred. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending ominous rumbles of thunder across the sky. "The nice cowboy's gone to get you medicine, Jamie," she whispered, stroking his hot cheek. "He's riding all night just for you, so you need to be strong for me, you hear? Be strong like your papa was." James whimpered in his sleep, his small face contorted with pain, and Bethany felt her resolve threatening to crumble. She had already lost so much. After Thomas died, she had somehow found the strength to keep going, to plant the fields and tend the animals and make a life for her son. But if she lost James too? She shook her head fiercely. No, she would not lose him. That stranger Lucas would return with medicine and James would recover. She had to believe that, or the darkness threatening to engulf her would win. To keep herself awake and her mind from spiraling into despair, she began to sing softly lullabies her own mother had sung to her, and later, the songs she had crooned to James since he was a babe in arms. Her voice cracked occasionally with emotion or fatigue, But she continued, one song flowing into the next as the hours crept by. Sometime after midnight, the storm broke in earnest. Rain lashed against the cabin walls and roof, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Bethany moved to check that the shutters were secure, pausing at the window to stare out into the tempest. Somewhere out there, Lucas Foster was battling these same elements, all for the sake of a woman and child he'd never met before tonight. "Please keep him safe," she whispered, unsure if she was praying to God or simply sending her wishes into the storm. "Bring him back to us." The thought startled her. Not just bring him back with the medicine, but bring him back to us, as if he belonged with them somehow. She pushed the strange notion aside. Her exhaustion and fear were making her thoughts wander. Lucas Foster was simply a good Samaritan, a passing cowboy with a kind heart, nothing more. Yet as she returned to James' bedside, she found herself wondering what had brought Lucas to her door tonight of all nights. Coincidence? Providence? Whatever it was, she was grateful beyond words, even as worry for his safety in the storm gnawed at her. The rain had soaked Lucas to the skin within minutes of the downpour beginning. The trail, difficult enough by moonlight, had become treacherous in the storm. Twice already, Apollo had nearly lost his footing on the slick mud, and Lucas knew he needed to find shelter soon or risk both their lives. He remembered a lined shack about a mile ahead, a simple structure used by cowboys during roundups when they were too far from the main ranch to return at night. If it was still standing, it would provide enough shelter to wait out the worst of the storm. "Just a bit further, boy," he encouraged Apollo, who was plodding doggedly forward despite the conditions. The shack, when they reached it, was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry inside and would serve their purpose. Lucas unsaddled Apollo and rubbed him down with an old blanket he found hanging from a peg. He couldn't risk building a fire that might draw unwanted attention. Not all travelers in these parts were as honest as he tried to be, so he made do with changing into the spare shirt from his saddlebags and wrapping himself in his duster. As he settled onto the rough wooden floor, his back against the wall, Lucas found his thoughts returning to Bethany Reynolds. There had been something about her that had struck him immediately, not just her beauty, though with her chestnut hair and clear green eyes, she was certainly beautiful. It was the quiet strength he'd sensed in her, the determination to fight for her son despite the odds stacked against her. He wondered what her story was. A widow, most likely, given that there had been no man present, and she'd mentioned being unable to pay him yet, as if she were responsible for the family's finances. The cabin had been neat but modest, suggesting she was managing on her own but just barely. Lucas had known many women in the territories who had lost husbands to disease, accidents, or violence. Some remarried quickly out of necessity. Others struggled on alone rather than tie themselves to men they didn't love. He'd seen the latter too often end in tragedy: homesteads abandoned, children orphaned when the burden became too much for one person to bear. The thought of Bethany and James facing such a fate made his chest tighten unexpectedly. He'd only just met them, yet already he felt responsible for them in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Focus on the medicine," he told himself firmly. "Get to Bisbee, get what the boy needs, and get back. That's your only job right now." But as he closed his eyes, trying to get what rest he could before continuing the journey at first light, it was Bethany's face he saw, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope as she'd watched him ride away. Dawn broke with the storm still raging, though the worst of it seemed to have passed. Lucas was already in the saddle, having given Apollo only the briefest rest. The horse was strong, but Lucas could feel the fatigue in his movements. Still, they couldn't delay. Every hour could mean the difference between life and death for James Reynolds. The trail to Bisbee was a muddy river now, making progress agonizingly slow. Lucas alternated between riding and leading Apollo on foot when the terrain became particularly treacherous. By the time the buildings of Bisbee came into view, the sun was high overhead hours later than he'd hoped to arrive. The mining town was bustling despite the weather, with men moving between the saloons, the general store, and the mines that had put Bisbee on the map. Lucas headed straight for the doctor's office, a small building on the main street with a weathered sign proclaiming Dr. William Harmon, physician and surgeon. He tied Apollo to the hitching post and burst through the door, dripping mud and water onto the clean floor of the waiting room. A young woman seated at a desk looked up in surprise. "I need to see the doctor right away," Lucas said, removing his hat. "It's an emergency." "The doctor is with a patient," the woman replied, her tone suggesting she was used to people claiming emergencies. "If you'll take a seat, madam. There's a 4-year-old boy about to die of scarlet fever out in Naco if I don't get medicine back to him today," Lucas interrupted, his voice low but intense. "I've ridden all night through that storm, and I aim to ride back just as soon as I have what he needs." Something in his expression must have convinced her of his sincerity, for she rose immediately. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared through a door at the back of the room. Moments later, a man in his 50s with graying hair and spectacles emerged, followed by the young woman. "I'm Dr. Harmon," he said briskly. "Nancy tells me you've come about a case of scarlet fever." Lucas nodded, quickly explaining James's symptoms and the situation at the Reynolds homestead. The doctor listened intently, asking a few pointed questions about the progression of the illness and the child's age and general health. "Scarlet fever can be deadly, especially in the young," Dr. Harmon said gravely when Lucas had finished. "But caught in time with proper treatment, many children recover fully." He moved to a cabinet and began selecting various bottles and packages. "I'll give you quinine for the fever, a salve for the rash, and a mixture for the cough. Follow the instructions I'll write down precisely." "Yes, sir," Lucas said, relief washing over him. "What do I owe you?" The doctor named a sum that made Lucas wince inwardly. It would take nearly half of what he was owed in Bisbee, but he nodded without hesitation. "The boy's mother said she can't pay right away, but I'll cover it, Doctor." Harmon paused in his preparations, studying Lucas curiously. "You're not family?" "No, sir. Just passing through." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "Good Samaritans are rare in these parts, Mr. Foster. The boy is fortunate you came along when you did." While the doctor finished preparing the medicines and writing out instructions, Lucas quickly arranged for fresh supplies from the general store, food that would be easy to prepare and nourishing for both Bethany and James during the boy's recovery. He collected his payment from the cattle broker, settled his bill with the doctor, and within an hour was ready to depart. "You should rest before heading back," Dr. Harmon advised, frowning at Lucas's obvious exhaustion. "The storms made the trails dangerous, and if you're too tired to navigate them properly—" "I appreciate the concern, Doc, but every hour counts," Lucas replied, carefully stowing the precious medicines in his saddlebags. "The boy's already been sick for 3 days." The doctor nodded reluctantly. "Then Godspeed, Mr. Foster. If the child's condition worsens despite the medicine, send for me. I can't promise I'll be able to come immediately, but I'll do what I can." Lucas thanked him and remounted Apollo, who had been fed and watered but still showed signs of fatigue. "Just one more hard ride, old friend," he murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Then we'll both get the rest we've earned." As he turned Apollo toward the trail back to Naco, Lucas felt a strange mixture of urgency and anticipation. He was eager to deliver the medicine that might save James's life, but he also found himself looking forward to seeing Bethany again. The thought surprised him. He'd spent most of his adult life avoiding attachments, finding it easier to move on when work dried up or troubles arose. Yet there was something about the young widow and her son that had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was simply that they needed him, and it had been a long time since anyone had. Whatever the reason, as he urged Apollo into a steady trot that the tired horse could maintain for the journey ahead, Lucas found himself hoping that his arrival at the Reynolds homestead would not be the end of his association with the family, but rather the beginning of something new. The day dragged endlessly for Bethany. James's condition had worsened overnight, his breathing becoming more labored, and his fever climbing despite her best efforts to cool him. By midday, he was slipping in and out of consciousness, sometimes not recognizing her when his eyes fluttered open briefly. "Stay with me, Jamie," she pleaded, spooning tiny amounts of broth between his cracked lips whenever he was lucid enough to swallow. "The medicine is coming. You just need to hold on a little longer." But as the afternoon wore on with no sign of Lucas Foster, doubt began to creep in. Had the storm delayed him? Had he been injured on the treacherous trails? Or the thought she tried hardest to suppress, had he simply decided the risk wasn't worth taking for strangers? She wouldn't blame him if he had. The rational part of her mind knew that riding through a storm at night for people he'd just met was asking more than anyone had a right to expect. Yet in her heart, she clung to the conviction that he would return. There had been something in his eyes when he'd promised to bring medicine, a steadfastness that had given her hope when she'd had none. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, James took a turn for the worse. His breathing became shallow and rapid, his skin hot and dry to the touch. The rash had spread to cover nearly every inch of his small body, and he no longer responded when she called his name. Panic clawed at Bethany's throat. She had done everything she could, bathed him with cool water, spooned broth and water into him whenever possible, prayed until her voice gave out, but it wasn't enough. Without medicine, she was going to lose him. The realization broke something inside her. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to collapse completely, sobs tearing from her throat as she gathered James's limp body against her chest. "Please don't leave me," she begged, rocking him gently. "Please, Jamie, you're all I have left." So consumed was she by grief that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly at her door. Then, suddenly, there was pounding on the wood and a voice calling her name. "Bethany, it's Lucas. I've got the medicine." For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then James gave a small, pained whimper in her arms, and she was galvanized into action. She laid him gently on the bed and rushed to throw open the door. Lucas Foster stood there, covered in mud, his face haggard with exhaustion but his eyes bright with determination. In his hands he held a package wrapped in oilcloth. "Thank God," Bethany whispered, pulling him inside. "He's worse, much worse." Lucas strode to the bedside, his expression grim as he took in James's condition. Without a word, he unwrapped the package, revealing several bottles and packets along with a sheet of paper covered in neat writing. "The doctor sent specific instructions," he said, quickly reading through them. "We need to get the fever down first. Then there's a mixture for his throat and lungs, and a salve for the rash." Together, they worked to administer the medicines, Bethany holding James while Lucas carefully measured doses according to the doctor's instructions. The boy was so weak he barely struggled when they spooned the bitter-tasting liquids into his mouth. "Now we wait," Lucas said when they had done all they could. He sank into a chair by the bed, the exhaustion of the past 24 hours finally catching up with him. The doctor said the fever should start to come down within a few hours if the medicine works. Bethany nodded, taking the chair on the opposite side of the bed. Now that the immediate crisis of getting the medicine was over, she took her first real look at Lucas since he'd arrived. His clothes were filthy and damp, his face drawn with fatigue, and there was a cut on his cheek that hadn't been there before. "You're hurt," she said softly. He touched his cheek as if surprised. "It's nothing. Branch caught me during the worst of the storm. I've had worse shaving." "You should rest," she insisted. "You've been riding for nearly a day straight." Lucas shook his head. "Not until we know the boy's going to be all right." His use of "we" wasn't lost on Bethany. In the space of a day, this stranger had somehow become a part of their struggle, invested in James's survival as if the boy were his own kin. The realization sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you've done, riding through that storm, getting the medicine. Most men wouldn't have. Most men haven't seen what happens when help doesn't come in time," Lucas interrupted quietly. His blue eyes met hers across the bed, and in them she saw old pain alongside the weariness. "I have." Bethany wanted to ask what he meant, but James stirred then, moaning in his sleep, and their attention returned immediately to the child. Lucas reached out to touch the boy's forehead, his large hand gentle against James's hot skin. "Still burning up," he murmured. "But the doctor said it might take time." They settled into a vigil that stretched through the evening hours, taking turns bathing James with cool water and administering the medicines at the intervals Dr. Harmon had prescribed. Lucas insisted that Bethany rest while he watched over the boy, and though she protested at first, her exhaustion eventually won out. She drifted into an uneasy sleep in the rocking chair by the fire, waking with a start whenever James cried out. It was well past midnight when she jerked awake to find Lucas bending over her son, his hand on James's forehead and a smile breaking across his tired face. "His fever's coming down," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. "Feel." Bethany placed her palm against James's cheek and nearly wept at the difference. The burning heat had subsided to a milder warmth, and his breathing seemed easier, less labored. "Thank God," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank God, and thank you, Lucas." On impulse, she threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest as relief overwhelmed her. After a moment's hesitation, his arms came around her, strong and steady, offering comfort and sharing in her joy. "He's going to be all right," Lucas murmured against her hair. "The worst is over." Bethany nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Only now, with James on the road to recovery, did she allow herself to feel the full weight of the fear she'd been carrying, the terror of losing her son, of being left completely alone in the world. Lucas seemed to understand, holding her until her tears subsided, making no move to pull away until she was ready. When she finally stepped back, wiping her eyes, he gave her a gentle smile that transformed his weather-beaten face, making him look younger and almost boyish despite the stubble shadowing his jaw. "The doctor sent food as well," he said, gesturing to the packages he'd brought. "And I picked up some supplies in Bisbee. You both need nourishment to recover your strength." Bethany insisted on preparing a simple meal while Lucas took his turn resting. Despite his protests that he was fine, he was asleep almost as soon as he settled into the chair she'd vacated, his hat pulled low over his eyes. She watched him for a moment, struck by how at ease he seemed in their humble cabin, as if he belonged there. The thought should have unsettled her. After all, Lucas Foster was a stranger who had ridden into their lives less than a day ago. Yet there was something about his presence that felt right, that eased the loneliness that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death. She turned away, focusing on the stew she was preparing, unwilling to examine these feelings too closely. Lucas had done them an enormous service, one she could never repay adequately. But he had his own life, his own plans, and once James was fully recovered, he would ride away just as he had ridden in unexpectedly and completely changing their world in the process. Dawn was breaking when James's eyes fluttered open, clear and aware for the first time in days. "Mama!" He croaked, his voice hoarse but stronger than it had been. Bethany was at his side instantly, gathering him into her arms. "I'm here, sweetheart. How do you feel?" "Thirsty," he said, looking around the cabin with confusion. His gaze landed on Lucas, who was awake now and watching them from his chair. "Who's that?" "That's Mr. Foster," Bethany explained, helping James sip water from a cup. "He's the one who brought the medicine that made you better." James studied Lucas with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you a doctor?" Lucas chuckled, moving to kneel beside the bed. "No, just a cowboy who happened to be passing by at the right time." "Mama said cowboys ride horses and fight bad guys," James said, his voice still weak but his eyes brightening with interest. "Do you have a horse?" "Did you fight bad guys?" "I do have a horse, a very brave one named Apollo, who rode all the way to Bisbee and back to get your medicine," Lucas told him. "And I've had my share of scrapes, but I try to avoid fighting when I can. Can I see your horse?" James asked eagerly, trying to sit up before Bethany gently pressed him back against the pillows. "When you're stronger," she promised. "Right now you need to rest and take your medicine so you can get well." James made a face at the mention of medicine, but he didn't protest when Lucas helped him take the next dose of Dr. Harmon's mixture. The boys' obvious improvement lifted all their spirits, and as the morning progressed, he was able to eat a small amount of broth and even stayed awake for longer periods. Lucas, meanwhile, insisted on making himself useful around the homestead. Despite Bethany's protests that he should rest, he repaired a loose shutter that had been damaged in the storm, chopped a fresh supply of firewood, and tended to the few animals. She kept 2 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, and an elderly mule that had belonged to Thomas. "You don't have to do all this," Bethany said, watching from the doorway as he finished mending the chicken coop. "You've already done more than enough." Lucas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the coolness of the spring day. "I don't mind. Feels good to be useful." He glanced toward the cabin where James was napping. "Besides, I'd like to stick around another day or two, make sure the boy's really on the mend before I move on." Bethany felt a flutter in her chest at his words, relief that he wasn't leaving immediately, followed by an unexpected pang at the thought that he would leave soon. "Of course," she said quickly. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like. It's the least I can offer after what you've done." He smiled, that same transformative expression that made her breath catch. "Then I accept, Mrs. Reynolds." "Bethany," she corrected. "Please." "Bethany," he repeated, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to his work. That evening, with James sleeping peacefully, his fever now completely gone, Bethany and Lucas sat at the small table sharing a simple supper. The easy silence between them was broken when Lucas finally asked the question she had been expecting. "What happened to your husband?" Bethany set down her fork, the familiar ache of grief rising in her chest, though it had dulled somewhat with time. "Thomas died last winter. He was hunting, trying to bring down a deer to see us through the cold months. The ice on the creek gave way beneath him. By the time he managed to drag himself home, he was half frozen, pneumonia set in, and—" She swallowed hard. "We buried him just before Christmas." Lucas nodded, his expression somber but not pitying. "I'm sorry. It's not easy being left to carry on alone." Something in his tone suggested he knew this from experience. "You lost someone too?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the cabin walls. "My whole family, though not all at once. Father first, he was gored by a bull when I was 15. Then my mother to typhoid 2 years later. My younger brother Caleb joined the Rangers and was killed in a skirmish with rustlers near the border." His mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "By 20, I was the last Foster standing." "I'm sorry," Bethany said, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. "It's a heavy burden to bear." Lucas's gaze returned to hers, something warming in his eyes at her touch. It was. "For a long time I didn't handle it well, drank too much, fought too often, moved whenever memories started catching up with me." He shrugged. "Eventually I figured out that running doesn't help. The ghosts follow you anyway." "So what does help?" Bethany asked, genuinely curious. She was still learning how to live with her own grief, how to build a life for James that wasn't completely shadowed by the absence of his father. "Finding purpose," Lucas answered without hesitation. "Having something or someone to care for besides yourself." He gestured around the cabin. "What you're doing here, making a home for your son, keeping this place going on your own, that takes courage. The kind I didn't have for a long time." Bethany felt her cheeks warm at the admiration in his voice. "I don't feel courageous most days, just tired and scared and alone." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and she looked away, embarrassed. "Being afraid doesn't mean you're not brave," Lucas said gently. "It just means the thing you're facing matters." His words settled over her like a balm, easing something tight in her chest. For months, she had been telling herself to be strong, to keep going for James's sake, never allowing herself to acknowledge how terrified she was of failing, of losing the farm, of not being able to provide for her son, of facing the future without a partner to share the burden. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand that she meant for more than just his words. Lucas nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Now tell me about this place. How long have you been here?" Grateful for the shift to safer ground, Bethany told him about the homestead, how she and Thomas had claimed the land 3 years earlier, building the cabin themselves and slowly developing the farm. She spoke of their plans to expand, to plant more crops and perhaps add a few head of cattle once they were established. "It's good land," Lucas observed, "with water nearby and enough flat ground for decent grazing. Your husband chose well." "We chose together," Bethany corrected. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I know good soil when I see it." Lucas looked impressed. "A woman who knows farming, that's rare in these parts." "Not so rare," she countered. "Most wives out here work the land alongside their husbands. We have to survive." "Fair point," he conceded. "Though not all have your knowledge or determination." The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on their respective backgrounds, their experiences in the territories, and eventually circling back to James. Lucas asked about the boy's interests and personality, listening intently as Bethany described her son's curiosity, his love of animals, and his tendency to ask questions about everything he encountered. "He sounds like a fine boy," Lucas said, genuine affection in his voice. "Smart, too." "He is," Bethany agreed proudly. "Too smart for his own good sometimes. Thomas used to say he'd either be a great scholar or the territory's most successful confidence man, depending on how we guided him." Lucas laughed, a rich sound that filled the small cabin and made Bethany smile in response. "With you as his mother, I'd bet on the scholar," he said, his eyes twinkling. The warmth in his gaze stirred something in Bethany that she had thought long buried, a flutter of awareness, of attraction to this kind, strong man who had risked his life to save her son. The feeling both exhilarated and terrified her. Thomas had been gone less than 6 months. Was it disloyal to feel this way about someone else so soon? As if sensing the direction of her thoughts, Lucas's expression sobered. "It's getting late," he said, rising from the table. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow will be another long day of nursing the boy back to health." Bethany nodded, both relieved and disappointed at the respite from her confusing emotions. "You can take the pallet by the fire," she offered. "It's not much, but it's better than the ground." "I've slept on worse," he assured her with a smile. "Thank you." As they prepared for the night, moving quietly around the cabin to avoid waking James, Bethany found herself acutely aware of Lucas's presence, the soft sounds of his movements, the way the firelight played across his features as he unrolled the bedding she had provided, the careful consideration he showed in giving her privacy to ready herself for sleep. It had been so long since she'd shared space with an adult, particularly a man, that the simple domestic routine felt both strange and comforting. By the time she slipped into bed beside James, her mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions: gratitude, attraction, guilt, hope, all centered around the tall cowboy now settling onto the pallet across the room. "Good night, Bethany," Lucas said softly as she blew out the lamp. "Good night, Lucas," she replied, her voice steady despite the tumult within. "And thank you again for everything." In the darkness, she couldn't see his face, but she heard the smile in his voice when he answered, "You're welcome. Now get some sleep. Morning comes early on a farm." It was such an ordinary thing to say, so domestic and familiar, that Bethany felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. How long had it been since someone had shared the rhythm of farm life with her? Since someone besides James had cared whether she rested well? As she drifted toward sleep, listening to James's now even breathing beside her and the occasional soft sounds of Lucas shifting on his pallet, Bethany allowed herself to imagine, just briefly, what it might be like if this arrangement were not temporary, if Lucas Foster became a permanent part of their lives rather than just a passing savior. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it sent her into slumber with a sense of peace she hadn't known since Thomas died. The next few days established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. James continued to improve, though the doctor's instructions were clear that he needed to rest completely for at least a week to avoid a relapse. This meant that the work of the farm fell to Bethany and Lucas, who insisted on shouldering as much of the burden as he could. "You need to focus on the boy," he told her when she protested that he was doing too much. "I've worked ranches all my life. This little homestead is nothing I can't handle." And indeed, he seemed to thrive on the labor, rising before dawn to milk the cows and tend to the other animals, before tackling whatever larger projects needed attention. The spring planting couldn't wait, regardless of James's illness, so Lucas took it upon himself to prepare the fields Thomas had cleared the previous fall. Watching him work from the cabin doorway, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up to reveal strong forearms as he guided the plow behind the elderly mule, Bethany felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, for his willing assistance, but also a growing admiration for his quiet competence, his gentle way with the animals, and his unfailing kindness toward James, who had become utterly enchanted with Mr. Lucas and his tales of life on the range. In the evenings, after James had been settled for the night, they would sit by the fire, talking about the day's work or sharing stories from their pasts. Bethany found herself opening up about things she rarely discussed: her hopes for James's future, her fears about managing the farm alone, even memories of Thomas that she had kept close to her heart since his death. Lucas, in turn, spoke of his years driving cattle across the territories, the sights he had seen, the people he had met. He was a gifted storyteller, painting vivid pictures with his words that made Bethany laugh and gasp in all the right places. But she noticed that, for all his tales, he rarely spoke of his plans for the future, or what had brought him to this part of Arizona in the first place. On the fifth evening after his arrival, as they sat shelling peas together at the table while James slept, Bethany finally asked the question that had been lingering in her mind. "Where were you headed when you stopped here?" Lucas's hand stilled briefly before resuming their work. "Nowhere in particular," he said after a moment. "I'd finished a drive to Bisbee and collected my pay. Was thinking of heading north, maybe into Colorado or even Montana. Heard there are opportunities for experienced hands up that way." "So you don't have a permanent position, a ranch you call home?" Bethany pressed gently. He shook his head, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Not for years now. I've worked for outfits all over Texas and the territories, but never stayed in one place very long." His eyes met hers across the table. "Never had a reason to." The implication hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. Bethany looked down, focusing on the peas in her lap to hide the flush she could feel rising in her cheeks. "And now," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "you still plan to head north?" Lucas was quiet for so long that she was forced to look up. He was watching her, his blue eyes intent, as if searching for something in her expression. "I'm not sure anymore," he admitted finally. "These past days, they've made me think about things differently." Bethany's heart quickened. "What things?" Settling down, finding a place to belong. He hesitated, then added softly, "Finding people to belong with." The meaning behind his words was unmistakable, and Bethany felt a surge of both joy and trepidation. Joy that this man, who had come to mean so much to her in such a short time, might be considering a future that included her and James. Trepidation because it seemed too fast, too soon after Thomas, too much like grasping at salvation rather than making a reasoned choice. "Lucas," she began carefully, "what you did for James for us I can never repay. But you don't owe us anything more. If you want to continue your journey to find opportunities elsewhere, is that what you think?" He interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "That I've stayed out of obligation or pity?" Bethany hesitated. The thought had crossed her mind that his kindness stemmed from feeling responsible for them rather than any deeper attachment. "I've stayed because I wanted to," Lucas continued when she didn't answer. "Because for the first time in years, I've found something that feels like it matters, helping you and James, working this land." He set aside the bowl of peas and reached across the table to take her hand. "Being with you." The touch of his calloused fingers against hers sent a tremor through Bethany. She stared at their joined hands, unable to meet his gaze for fear of what he might see in her eyes, the longing, the confusion, the guilt that still lingered when she thought of Thomas. "It's too soon," she whispered. "Thomas has only been gone a few months. I can't." "I know," Lucas said, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it. "I'm not asking for anything right now, Bethany. I just wanted you to understand why I've stayed and why I'm in no hurry to leave unless you want me to go." She looked up then, startled. "I don't want you to go," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "James adores you and the help you've given us. I don't know what we would have done without you." Lucas smiled, though there was a shadow of something like disappointment in his eyes. "Then I'll stay a while longer, at least until James is fully recovered and the spring planting is done." Bethany nodded, both relieved and strangely bereft, as if she had missed an opportunity she wasn't sure would come again. "Thank you." They returned to shelling peas in a silence that was not quite as comfortable as before. each lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired between them and what had not. The following day brought an unexpected visitor to the Reynolds homestead. Bethany was hanging laundry while Lucas repaired the corral fence when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the trail leading from town. A man on horseback approached, his clothing marking him as a townsman rather than a rancher or farmer. As he drew closer, Bethany recognized Harold Winters, the owner of the general store in Naco and one of the few people who had been consistently kind to her since Thomas's death. "Mrs. Reynolds," he called, tipping his hat as he reined in his horse. His eyes moved curiously to Lucas, who had set down his tools and come to stand beside Bethany. "Mr. Winters," Bethany greeted him. "This is a surprise. Is everything all right in town?" "Everything's fine, madam. Just making my monthly rounds to the outlying homesteads." Winters dismounted, leading his horse forward. "Thought I'd check if you needed any supplies." His gaze shifted back to Lucas. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Lucas Foster," Lucas introduced himself, extending his hand. "I've been helping Mrs. Reynolds while her boy recovers from scarlet fever." Winters's eyebrows rose. "Scarlet fever? That's serious business. The boy's all right. He's much improved," Bethany assured him. "Thanks to Mr. Foster, who rode to Bisbee for medicine during the worst of the storm last week." Admiration and something like speculation crossed Winters's face as he shook Lucas's hand. "That's quite a service you've done the widow and her son, Mr. Foster. Not many would risk such a journey in those conditions." "Anyone would have done the same," Lucas replied modestly. Winters chuckled. "We both know that's not true, but it's good of you to say so." He turned his attention back to Bethany. "I've brought your monthly order flour, sugar, coffee, and such, and there's a letter for you from back east." Bethany's face lit up at the mention of a letter. Communication from her family in Missouri was rare and treasured. "Thank you, Mr. Winters. Would you care to come in for coffee?" "Don't mind if I do," the storekeeper agreed, following Bethany toward the cabin while Lucas returned to his work on the fence, promising to join them shortly. Inside, James was delighted by the visitor, especially when Winters produced a stick of candy from his pocket as a get-well present. While the boy happily sucked on his treat, Bethany prepared coffee and listened to Winters's news of the town new settlers arriving, plans for a proper schoolhouse to be built by fall, and various bits of gossip about their neighbors. "Your friend out there," Winters said eventually, lowering his voice though Lucas was well out of earshot. "He's been here a while." Bethany felt herself tensing at the implied question. "Nearly a week." "He arrived the night James took a turn for the worse and has been kind enough to help with the farm while we recover." Winters nodded thoughtfully. "He seems a decent sort, wondering if he's planning to settle in the area." "I'm not sure of his plans," Bethany admitted, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Winters was a kind man, but like most small-town storekeepers, he was also the nexus of local gossip. Whatever she said would likely be repeated in Naco within days. "Well, if he is," Winters continued, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort, "tell him to stop by the store. I often hear of opportunities for good men in these parts." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And a man who'd ride through a storm to save a child he'd just met is the kind of neighbor Naco could use more of." Before Bethany could respond, the door opened and Lucas entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Fence is patched," he reported. "Should hold the next time that old bull of Hadley's decides to visit." Winters laughed. "Old Brutus been causing trouble again. That animal's been escaping Hadley's property for years. Man needs to invest in better fencing." The conversation shifted to the vagaries of livestock and local ranching practices, much to Bethany's relief. By the time Winters departed an hour later, the uncomfortable moment had passed, though she couldn't help noticing the speculative glances the storekeeper cast between her and Lucas as he took his leave. "Nice fellow," Lucas remarked as they watched Winters ride away. "Seems to think highly of you." Bethany nodded. "He was kind to us when we first arrived, extended credit when we needed it to get started. And after Thomas died, he was one of the few who didn't either avoid me or suggest I needed to remarry immediately for propriety's sake." Lucas's expression darkened slightly at her words. "You've had pressure to remarry, some," Bethany admitted, turning to walk back to the cabin. "It's common for widows out here, especially those with children and property. Men see it as practical rather than personal." "And you?" Lucas asked quietly, falling into step beside her. "What do you see it as?" Bethany considered the question seriously. "I think marriage should be more than a practical arrangement, though I understand why many settle for that. My parents had a love match, rare for their generation. They taught me to expect the same. And you found it with Thomas." There was no jealousy in Lucas's tone, only genuine interest. "Yes," she said softly. "We were very young. I was 18 when we wed, but we grew together. Built something real." Lucas nodded, his gaze moving across the homestead, the cabin, the small barn, the newly planted fields. "You built something worth fighting for," he observed. "Worth staying for." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Bethany found herself holding her breath, waiting for what might come next. But James called from inside the cabin just then, breaking the moment, and the conversation turned to other things as they went to attend to the boys' needs. That night, as Bethany sat by the fire mending one of James's shirts, her mind kept returning to the almost conversation with Lucas. Was he considering staying permanently? And if he was, what did that mean for her and James? For the feelings that continued to grow between them, despite her attempts to maintain a proper distance, the letter Winters had brought provided a welcome distraction from these troubling thoughts. It was from her sister in Missouri, full of family news and inquiries about Bethany and James. Near the end, her sister mentioned that she and her husband had discussed inviting Bethany to bring James and return to Missouri now that Thomas was gone. "We have plenty of room," Rebecca had written, "and James could grow up with his cousins. No one expects you to manage that homestead alone, Bethy. Come home where family can help you." The offer was tempting in many ways. Life in the territories was hard, especially for a woman alone with a young child. In Missouri, she would have family support, James would have better educational opportunities, and the constant struggle against the elements would ease considerably. Yet as she looked around the cabin at James sleeping peacefully in the bed, his color finally back to normal, at Lucas dozing in the chair opposite her, his features softened in sleep, at the small but comfortable home she and Thomas had built together, Bethany knew she didn't want to leave. This land, this life they had carved out of the wilderness, was part of her now, part of James, and perhaps she was beginning to hope, part of a future that might include Lucas Foster. The realization both frightened and exhilarated her. Was she ready to consider such a future? To open her heart to the possibility of loving again? And even if she was Lucas truly interested in settling down? Or was his presence simply an extended act of kindness that would eventually end when he moved on, as had been his pattern for years? These questions chased each other through Bethany's mind, keeping her awake long after she had set aside her mending and retired to bed. Beside her, James mumbled in his sleep, curling closer to her warmth. Outside, an owl called, its haunting cry carrying on the night breeze. And across the room, Lucas's steady breathing provided a counterpoint to her racing thoughts, a reminder of the man who had ridden through darkness to save her son, and who now stood at the crossroads of her life. offering a path she hadn't expected to find again so soon if ever. As spring advanced toward summer, James regained his strength completely, once again racing around the homestead with the boundless energy of childhood. The boy had attached himself firmly to Lucas, following him around whenever Bethany would allow it, listening raptly to his stories and begging to learn how to ride like a real cowboy. Lucas, for his part, showed remarkable patience with the child, teaching him simple tasks around the farm and telling him stories of life on the range during their evening meals. The easy rapport between them warmed Bethany's heart, even as it complicated her already confused emotions regarding Lucas's continued presence. For though James's recovery was complete and the spring planting finished, Lucas showed no signs of preparing to leave. Instead, he had begun making improvements to the homestead that suggested longer-term plans, repairing the roof of the barn, clearing additional land for future crops, even building a proper corral for the animals that was far sturdier than the makeshift enclosure Thomas had erected. When Bethany questioned these projects, Lucas simply shrugged and said, "These things need doing, and I'm here to do them." But the look in his eyes, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, told her there was more to it than simple helpfulness. Their relationship had settled into a comfortable partnership during daylight hours, working side by side on the tasks that kept the small farm running, sharing meals, caring for James. But in the evenings, when the boy was asleep, a different energy hummed between them. Conversations that started innocuously enough often veered into more personal territory, revealing their hopes, fears, and values in ways that deepened their connection with each passing day. Bethany learned that beneath Lucas's capable exterior lay a thoughtful man who read voraciously when he could get his hands on books, who had strong opinions about justice and fairness, and who harbored a secret talent for whittling beautiful small animals out of scrap wood. Lucas discovered Bethany's quick wit, her knowledge of botany, passed down through generations of women in her family, and her surprisingly beautiful singing voice that she used mainly when she thought no one was listening. These revelations, small as they might seem individually, wove together to create an intimacy that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet neither of them spoke directly of what was developing between them. As if by unspoken agreement, they had decided to let it unfold naturally, without the pressure of declarations or demands. Then came the day that changed everything. James had been begging for weeks to visit town, eager to show off his recovery to the people who had sent well wishes during his illness. Bethany had resisted, wanting to ensure he was truly strong enough for the journey, but finally relented when Lucas offered to drive them in the small wagon he had repaired for just such purposes. The trip to Naco was a festive occasion for James, who chattered excitedly from his perch between Bethany and Lucas on the wagon seat. The town itself was little more than a wide spot in the road: a general store, a small church, a saloon, and a handful of other businesses strung along a dusty main street. But to a child who had been confined to the homestead for weeks, it might as well have been a metropolitan city. Winters greeted them warmly at the store, making a fuss over James's recovery and offering the boy a piece of rock candy while Bethany gathered supplies. Other townspeople stopped by to welcome them, many expressing surprise and pleasure at seeing the Reynolds boy looking so healthy after his brush with scarlet fever. "That's quite a miracle," Mrs. Thornton, the minister's wife, remarked, patting James's head. "We were all praying for him when we heard how sick he was." "It wasn't a miracle, madam," James piped up before Bethany could respond. "It was Mr. Lucas. He rode all night in the storm to get my medicine. Mama says he saved my life, Mrs." Thornton's eyebrows rose as she looked between Bethany and Lucas, who was busy loading their purchases into the wagon. "Is that so?" she murmured. "How providential that Mr. Lucas happened to be there when you needed help." The subtle emphasis on "happened" wasn't lost on Bethany, nor was the speculative gleam in the older woman's eye. Before she could clarify the circumstances of Lucas's arrival, James was tugging at her skirt, asking to see the blacksmith shop across the street. "Go ahead," Lucas said, approaching them. "I'll finish loading the supplies." Grateful for the reprieve from Mrs. Thornton's thinly veiled curiosity, Bethany allowed James to pull her toward the smithy. As they crossed the street, she was acutely aware of the gazes following them. The minister's wife was already deep in conversation with another woman, both of them glancing frequently in Lucas's direction. "Small towns," she muttered under her breath. "Nothing better to do than gossip." The blacksmith shop provided a welcome distraction for James, who was fascinated by the sparks flying from the forge and the huge draft horses waiting to be shod. The smith, a burly man named Jensen, greeted them heartily and showed James how he shaped the horseshoes, even allowing the boy to pump the bellows under close supervision. They were just preparing to leave when a commotion erupted outside. Loud voices, angry shouts, and then the unmistakable sound of a fist connecting with flesh sent Bethany rushing to the door. James clutched protectively against her side. In the street outside the saloon, two men were engaged in a brutal fight. One was a stranger, tall, heavy-set, with a thick beard and clothes that marked him as a drifter. The other, to Bethany's horror, was Lucas. Even as she watched, the stranger landed a punishing blow to Lucas's jaw that sent him staggering backward. But Lucas recovered quickly, ducking under the next swing and driving his own fist into the man's midsection with enough force to double him over. "Lucas!" Bethany cried, instinctively starting forward before Jensen's hand on her arm stopped her. "Stay back, Mrs. Reynolds," the blacksmith advised. "That's no place for a woman or child." "But what happened? Why are they fighting?" she demanded, holding James close as he tried to peek around her skirts at the spectacle. Jensen shrugged. "Don't know for sure. Heard raised voices, then they were at it, something about insults being thrown." The fight continued, both men landing blows that would leave marks for days. Blood streamed from a cut above Lucas's eye, but he fought with a controlled precision that spoke of experience rather than blind rage. The stranger, in contrast, swung wildly, his face contorted with fury. Finally, Sheriff Davis pushed through the gathering crowd, his revolver drawn. "That's enough," he shouted. "Break it up or I'll throw both of you in jail." The men separated, breathing hard, each watching the other warily. The stranger spat blood onto the dirt, his glare murderous as he addressed Lucas. "This ain't over, Foster. Nobody talks to Bart Regan that way and walks away clean." Lucas straightened, wiping blood from his face with his sleeve. "It's over if you've got any sense, Regan." "Take your business elsewhere." The sheriff moved between them. "I said that's enough. Regan, you've worn out your welcome in Naco. I suggest you move on now." For a moment, it seemed the man might argue, but a glance at the sheriff's determined expression, and the unsympathetic crowd changed his mind. With a final glare at Lucas, he stalked toward the hitching post where his horse waited, mounted, and rode out of town at a gallop. Bethany pushed through the dispersing crowd, James still clutched firmly against her side. "Lucas, are you all right? What happened?" Lucas turned at her voice, his expression changing from hard anger to regret as he saw her concern. "I'm fine," he assured her, though the blood still trickling from the cut above his eye belied his words. "Just a misunderstanding." Sheriff Davis snorted. "Some misunderstanding. That fellow was in the saloon running his mouth about a widow and her hired help out by Coyote Creek. Said some things no decent man would repeat. Bethany felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the man had been talking about her and Lucas. James tugged at her skirt, his face confused. "Mama, is Mr. Lucas hurt?" "Just a scratch," Lucas told the boy, forcing a smile despite his split lip. Nothing to worry about. But there was plenty to worry about, as Bethany well knew. Gossip was one thing, a few raised eyebrows or speculative glances from townsfolk who might wonder about Lucas's presence at her homestead. But if it had reached the point where strangers in the saloon were making crude remarks, "We should go home," she said quietly. "James is getting tired." Lucas nodded, understanding the unspoken message in her eyes. This was a conversation they needed to have in private. The ride back to the homestead was subdued. James, worn out from the excitement of the day, dozed against Bethany's side while she and Lucas sat in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until the boy had been put to bed, exhausted from the trip, that they were finally able to speak freely. "I'm sorry," Lucas said immediately, standing by the fireplace while Bethany cleaned the cut above his eye with gentle hands. "I shouldn't have lost my temper." "What did he say?" she asked, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "The truth, Lucas." He sighed, wincing slightly as she dabbed at the cut. "Nothing worth repeating, just the usual filth men like that spew when they've had too much to drink." "About me," Bethany pressed. "About us." Lucas met her gaze directly. "Yes." He'd heard talk in town about a widow who had a man staying at her place, made some assumptions about what kind of arrangement it might be. Bethany's hand stilled. "And you defended my honor by punching him." "I asked him to stop first," Lucas offered with a hint of his usual humor. "He declined." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Bethany felt a small smile tug at her lips. "So gallant," she murmured, resuming her ministrations. "But also foolish. That man could have killed you." "Hardly," Lucas scoffed. "Bart Regan is all talk and cheap whiskey. I've handled worse." "That's not the point," Bethany said, setting aside the cloth and stepping back to look at him properly. "The point is that people are talking. About us. About what it means that you've been here for weeks now with no apparent intention of leaving." Lucas's expression sobered. "Does it bother you?" "What they're saying? Of course it bothers me," she admitted. "Not for myself, I've endured gossip before, but for James, and—" she hesitated. "For you, your reputation." Lucas laughed softly at that. "Bethany, I'm a drifting cowhand with no fixed address and few possessions. My reputation isn't exactly sterling to begin with." "That's not true," she insisted. "You're a good man, Lucas Foster. Anyone who knows you can see that." His eyes softened at her words, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering in their blue depths. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "But you're right about the talk. It's not fair to you or James to let it continue without clarifying things." Bethany's heart stuttered in her chest. "Clarifying?" Lucas took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "Bethany, I've been trying to find the right moment, the right words for weeks now. I know it hasn't been long since Thomas died. I know you may not be ready to think about another man in your life. But I can't keep pretending I'm just helping out a neighbor when the truth is, I've fallen in love with you." The confession, so simply stated yet so profound, left Bethany momentarily speechless. She had suspected, hoped even, that Lucas's feelings ran deeper than friendship, but to hear him say it outright, to use the word love, was overwhelming. "Lucas, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Let me finish, please. I need to say this while I have the nerve." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the slight tremble in his normally steady hands. I love you, Bethany Reynolds. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you sing when you think no one's listening, the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, the way you love your son with every fiber of your being." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "And I love James too. That boy has worked his way into my heart just as surely as you have. The thought of leaving you both tears me apart inside." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Oh, Lucas," she whispered. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he assured her quickly. "If you need more time, I understand. If you can never feel for me what I feel for you, I'll accept that too. But I had to tell you the truth, because I can't keep living in this halfway place, pretending I don't want to build a life with you and James." Bethany reached up, touching his face gently, tracing the line of his jaw where a bruise was already forming from the fight. "You're wrong about one thing," she said softly. "I don't need more time." Hope blazed in Lucas's eyes. "You don't?" She shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "I've been fighting my feelings for weeks, telling myself it was too soon, that I was being disloyal to Thomas's memory. But the truth is, my heart made its decision the night you rode through that storm to save my son." She took a shaky breath. "I love you, Lucas. I think I've loved you since the moment you knelt beside James's bed and promised to bring back the medicine he needed." A joy unlike any he had ever known washed over Lucas's face. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with all the emotion they had been holding back for so long. Bethany melted into the kiss, her arms sliding around his neck as his encircled her waist. It felt both familiar and entirely new, the comfort of being held by someone who truly cared for her, combined with the exhilaration of discovering a connection she had thought never to find again. When they finally parted, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "Marry me," he whispered. "Not because of the gossip or for propriety's sake, but because we belong together, you, me, and James. Because I want to spend the rest of my life building something with you, watching James grow up, maybe giving him brothers and sisters someday." Tears of happiness flowed freely down Bethany's cheeks now. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Lucas Foster." His smile was radiant as he kissed her again, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm until she laughed against his lips. "When?" he asked eagerly. "How soon can we make it official?" Bethany considered. The traditional mourning period for a widow was a year, but out here in the territories, such conventions were often adapted to the realities of frontier life. "A month," she decided. Time enough to make proper arrangements and for James to get used to the idea, but not so long that the gossips have more fuel for their fire. Lucas nodded, sobering slightly. "Are you sure Thomas would approve? I don't want to dishonor his memory or your marriage to him." The question touched Bethany deeply. "Thomas wanted James and me to be happy and safe above all else," she said with certainty. "He would approve of a man who rode through a storm to save his son's life, who stepped in when we needed help most, and who loves us both enough to put down roots after years of drifting." She smiled, blinking away fresh tears. "He would approve of you, Lucas. I know it in my heart." Relief and gratitude mingled in Lucas's expression. "Then a month it is," he agreed. "And in the meantime, I should probably start sleeping in the barn to quiet the gossip." Bethany laughed at that. "Probably," she conceded, though the thought of him being even that far away after they had finally acknowledged their feelings made her heart ache a little. Though it seems ridiculous when nothing improper has happened. "It's a small price to pay," Lucas assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. "And worth every uncomfortable night to know that at the end of it, I'll have the right to call you my wife." The word sent a thrill through Bethany, wife. She had been Thomas's wife, and that role had defined her for years. Now she would be Lucas's wife, a new chapter in her life that she had never expected but suddenly couldn't imagine foregoing. "There's one more thing," she said, suddenly remembering. "We need to tell James." Lucas's face lit up. "Can we tell him tomorrow? I want to be there when he hears." "Of course," Bethany agreed. "He'll be overjoyed. He adores you already." "And I him," Lucas said softly. "I never thought I'd have a family again after losing mine. Now I have a chance at not just any family but one with you and James. It's more than I ever dared hope for." Bethany leaned into his embrace, resting her head against his chest where she could hear the strong, steady beat of his heart. "It's funny," she mused. "When James fell ill, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen, that I might lose him after already losing Thomas. I never imagined that his illness would bring you to our door, that out of such fear could come such joy." Lucas tightened his arms around her. "Life has a way of surprising us," he agreed. "Sometimes in ways we never could have predicted." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms while James slept peacefully nearby, Bethany knew that truer words had never been spoken. The cowboy who had ridden through the night to save her son had ended up saving her too, not just from the practical difficulties of managing alone, but from the loneliness and fear that had threatened to overwhelm her since Thomas's death. In Lucas Foster, she had found not a replacement for what she had lost, but something new and equally precious: a second chance at love, a partner for the journey ahead, and a father for the son she cherished above all else. What had begun as a desperate night of illness and fear had blossomed into hope for a future brighter than she had dared to dream possible. The following morning, they told James over breakfast. The boy's initial confusion, "But Mr. Lucas already lives with us," gave way to delight when he understood that Lucas would be his new papa officially, that they would be a family forever. "Does this mean I can learn to ride Apollo now?" James asked eagerly, referring to Lucas's beloved bay. Lucas laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "We'll start with something a bit smaller, partner. But yes, I'll teach you to ride proper, and a whole lot more besides." As James peppered Lucas with questions about all the things they would do together, Bethany watched them, her heart so full it felt it might burst. This was what she had feared. She would never have again not just a husband, but a father for her son. A complete family unit facing the world together. Word spread quickly through the small community. Winters arrived the very next day, ostensibly to deliver a package that had been delayed but clearly bursting with curiosity about the news he had already heard in town. Mrs. Thornton and several other ladies from the church appeared the day after, offering congratulations that were genuine if tinged with the satisfaction of having their speculations confirmed. True to his word, Lucas moved his sleeping quarters to the barn, though he spent every waking hour with Bethany and James, working the farm, planning for their future, and discussing the small wedding they would have at the church in Naco. As the appointed day drew near, Bethany found herself thinking often of Thomas, not with the sharp pain of recent grief, but with a gentle sadness tempered by gratitude for the years they had shared, and the son who carried his features and his name. She visited his grave on the hill behind the cabin, telling him about Lucas, about James's recovery, about the new life she was embracing. "I'll always love you," she whispered to the simple wooden cross that marked his resting place. "You were my first love, the father of my child, the man who brought me west and showed me I was stronger than I knew. I'll make sure James remembers you, knows who you were and how much you loved him." She touched the cross gently. "And I think you'd like Lucas. He's a good man, Thomas." Different from you in many ways, but with the same kind heart, the same steadfastness. He'll take care of us. He already has. The day of the wedding dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day that seemed to reflect the new beginning they were celebrating. The church in Naco was filled to capacity, not just with the locals who had come to know and respect Bethany during her time in the territory, but also with cowboys from the surrounding ranches who knew Lucas from his years driving cattle through the area. James, dressed in his Sunday best and taking his role as ring bearer with utmost seriousness, walked ahead of Bethany down the aisle. Lucas waited at the front, his normally weathered face transformed by a smile of such joy and tenderness that it brought tears to Bethany's eyes. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days, with James standing proudly between them, holding both their hands as the minister pronounced them husband and wife. When Lucas kissed her, sealing their commitment before God and the community, Bethany felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that confirmed every instinct that had led her to this moment. The celebration afterward was lively, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire town twice over, courtesy of the ladies of the church, who had taken the wedding as a personal challenge to outdo one another's cooking. Lucas and Bethany moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes, their hands rarely separating as if they couldn't bear to break the physical connection between them, even briefly. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the gathering, Winters approached them with a broad smile and an envelope in his hand. "A wedding gift," he explained, pressing the envelope into Lucas's free hand. "From myself and several others who appreciate what you two have built together." Puzzled, Lucas opened the envelope to find a deed inside the deed to 20 acres of land adjoining the Reynolds homestead, prime grazing land with a year-round spring. "We took up a collection," Winters explained as Lucas and Bethany stared at the document in disbelief. "Figured a man with your experience with cattle might want to expand beyond just farming. That land's been sitting unclaimed for years, and now it's yours legally filed and everything." "I don't know what to say," Lucas managed, genuinely moved by the generosity of people he had known for such a short time. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." Winters waved away his thanks. "Just be good to each other and that boy of yours. And maybe raise some fine beef for us all in a few years' time." He winked. "That'll be thanks enough." As the celebration wound down and they prepared to return to the homestead, their home now, truly shared, James fell asleep in the back of the wagon, worn out from the excitement of the day. Lucas drove with one hand, the other wrapped firmly around Bethany's as she leaned against his shoulder. "Happy, Mrs. Foster?" he asked softly, using her new name for the first time. Bethany smiled, the title still strange but wonderfully right to her ears. "Happier than I thought possible," she admitted. "And you?" Lucas turned to kiss her forehead, his eyes shining in the gathering dusk. "I've spent most of my life moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. Now I have a wife, a son, land of our own. Everything I never knew I wanted until I found you. It's funny to think it all started with a sick child and a desperate ride through the night," Bethany mused. "If James hadn't fallen ill, if you hadn't happened to be passing by just then." "I don't believe it was chance," Lucas said firmly. "Some things are meant to be, Bethany. We were meant to find each other, to build this life together. I believe that with everything in me." As they crested the small rise that revealed their homestead, in the distance the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn Lucas had repaired, the fields they had planted together, and now the additional land that would allow them to expand, Bethany felt a profound sense of coming full circle. What had begun in fear and desperation had transformed into love and hope, a new chapter in a story that was still unfolding. "I believe it too," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Welcome home, Lucas." In the years that followed, the Foster homestead flourished. Lucas's knowledge of cattle combined with Bethany's farming skills created a prosperous small ranch that became known throughout the territory for its quality beef and crops. James grew into a strong, capable young man who inherited his biological father's quick mind and his adoptive father's steady nature. 2 years after their wedding, Bethany gave birth to twins, a boy they named Thomas in honor of James's father, and a girl they called Rebecca after Bethany's sister. 3 years later, another son joined the family, completing their household with laughter, occasional chaos, and abundant love. Often, especially on clear nights when the stars spread like diamonds across the Arizona sky, Bethany and Lucas would sit on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching their children play or listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. In those moments, they would sometimes speak of that fateful night when a desperately ill child and a storm-battered cowboy had brought them together against all odds. "I rode through the darkness thinking I was saving a stranger's child," Lucas would say, his arm around Bethany's shoulders, "never knowing I was riding toward my own future, my own family." And Bethany would lean into his embrace, grateful beyond words for the man who had braved a storm to bring medicine to her son, and in doing so had brought healing to her heart as well. Out of the darkest night of her life had come the brightest dawn, a love story written in courage and sacrifice, in tenderness and hope, a love that had begun with a desperate ride to save a child, but had saved them all in ways they never could have imagined.